Chris, maybe we'll start off with the way this installation fits in with the context of your body of work. I know you've been doing video installation for a number of years, and you've mentioned that this is, in some ways, different from the other work.
Yes.
But perhaps we could just look at that from kind of the physicality of the work as opposed to a conceptual concern.
Yes, okay. I think that there are connections across the work, inevitably, that always happens. What goes from work to work, or at least what's transferred from earlier pieces that's crucial for me, is this notion of flow and trying to do something which looks at the tactility of the screen or the tactility of the images and creates also an additional kind of more sculptural tactility and the relationship between the two, between the illusion created by the fan, for example, and the parallel that it makes with the illusion on the screen, that sort of thing, so that the two experiences are running together. In this piece, the images take up less space physically. That's the most important thing, or at least comparison between earlier installations and this one. But I think that the images are conceptually as important as in earlier pieces. But what I was interested in doing was getting away from the kind of work that just hit the audience with images. It would be far less striking a piece in terms of what was coming off the screens, and that there would be more work being done by the objects in the space. So it was more sculpture, less video installation. And there's a lot of movement. In fact, there's much more movement in the space off the screen. What happens on the screens is very contained, whereas what's happening in the rest of the space in terms of the objects that go to make the piece up, there's more movement in a sense. So I was interested in focusing or shifting the focus away from the images, at least at that level. But the images remain quite intense, very bright, very strongly saturated, and somewhat artificial. We're very used to seeing the world through the screen, and so we tend to get used to seeing that representation. And so I'm quite interested in playing with that in some sense, making pieces of work that refer to the experience of looking at images on the screen, and making images which are, once you begin to look at them, you realize that they aren't just natural images, that there's something about them which isn't natural. I mean, in the case of the kite, it's an animation, it's not natural at all, although it's built of bits that were at some stage photographic. But the whole thing's an illusion, and I want the illusion to be apparent. The whole installation is about illusion of one sort or another, whether it's the illusion of the wind in the space, whether it's the illusion of how the whole thing is being powered, the illusion of the images, the representation of the earth and the sky. All of those things are, at one level or another, about the artificial nature of representation. Well, I suppose nature is out there somewhere. It's something that we use to identify what we are. You know, we say, okay, there's nature, we're in it, but we're also able to be apart from it in some way. So it stands as some kind of an ideal. So it seems natural to take that ideal and to play with it, and to use it to make references back to ourselves and back to the nature of our perception and so on. So that's why I use it. I am interested in landscape and a perception of landscape, and there is a whole tradition, of course, in art of going out into the landscape, whether it's with a canvas or with a camera. And so I see what I'm doing as part of that tradition. So in that sense, it's part of a long history, and I like that connection between the history of art and what I'm doing. So that's part of why the landscape is there. But also I'm interested in the way that landscape can be portrayed or depicted or represented, and the idea of bringing something of the natural world into the neutral gallery space, so-called neutral gallery space. The frame is a very particular set of proportions in television, and of course I make no attempt to hide that, either in the projected image or in the image on the monitor. I stay with that format because it's a familiar one, and because it's one that I want to make a reference to. I don't want the things to not be television, I still want them to connect to television. But I think television means something very different to what it meant 30, 40 years ago. I mean, that's the interesting thing about television. It's transformed by the fact that someone, I think maybe 20 years ago, realized that the way forward with computers was to fuse the computer and the television together. Before that, they were completely separate things. And what's happening in television, or at least with the thing we used to call television, is that it's becoming part of everything, whether it's the telephone, whether it's computer displays. Every aspect of technology seems to eventually find itself connected to television. Initially, I had been researching into how to power an outdoor piece, and I got as far as discovering that it may be possible to power a piece using a combination of wind and solar power. And so it was off the back of that research that this piece came about. And I got quite interested in the idea of the contradiction with having something that was designed to work outside in a natural environment in a gallery space. And it seemed to me that it coincided with what I was doing with images of the natural world. So that's where it came from, really. And I thought it echoed. I was interested in the way having an artificial wind in the gallery and using that to generate electricity to power an artificial image. There was a kind of echo between the generation of the electricity that way and the image that we were seeing on the screen. And so that was initially what attracted me to trying it with this piece. I wanted also to play on this idea that the electricity was being created using something which was supposedly ecologically sound, but in fact it was being powered by something which was plugged into the wall. I thought that was also an interesting little jab, I suppose, at the piecemeal way that we as a society approach ecology. It's always just a little bit like, well, we'll recycle a couple of bottles, or we'll generate a little bit of electricity using wind. There's no overall plan, and there needs to be. And so I was interested in that. And the other parallel that I got caught up in was the one about the endless loop of the video, or rather the computer image. Once I started working with computers, I discovered that you could simply loop an image and it would play as long as there was power going to it. And so then I thought there was a nice little touch that as long as there was power going to it, of course, as long as there was power coming from the wind, we could power it. And as long as the power was coming from the fan that was plugged into the wall, so it seemed to echo back on itself in a way.
Okay, shooting.